I built that cabin alone. Nobody knew it existed. Then I got a 4 a.m. fire alert, and a stranger's call changed everything. 4:17 in the morning, and the sky to the west was the wrong color. Carter Aldridge drove 80 miles an hour toward a fire he already knew he couldn't stop, toward 11 acres of silence he had spent years protecting from the world. By the time he turned down the gravel lane, the cabin was already gone. A place no one was supposed to know existed. A place where someone had come, broken in, poured something flammable and walked away. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known standing in the November dark watching the embers cool, was that someone had been watching. Someone had written his name down, and she was about to pick up the phone. The call came at 4:17 in the morning, and Carter Aldridge knew before he even answered it that something had gone wrong. There was a particular kind of silence that settled over a man when his gut already knew what his ears were about to hear. A held breath quiet, like the world pressing pause before impact. He sat up in his bed in the Germantown apartment, heart already working faster than sleep should allow, and picked up the phone. It was automated. A fire detection alert from the property system he'd installed 2 years back, a modest cellular unit connected to a pair of smoke sensors he'd mounted himself on a rainy Saturday afternoon. The property address appeared on his screen, 2714 Chalk Ridge Road, Dixon County, the cabin. Carter was dressed and in his truck in less than 4 minutes. He'd bought the land 6 years ago with the money he'd saved during 3 tours and a year of medical leave. It wasn't much. 11 acres of second-growth timber on a ridge above a creek hollow, accessible by a gravel lane that most people didn't know was a lane at all. He'd built the cabin himself over 2 summers, working weekends and vacation days, learning as he went from library books and YouTube tutorials and the occasional advice of his Uncle Roy, who'd spent 40 years doing carpentry in Clarksville before his knees gave out. The result was modest but solid. 800 square feet of tongue-and-groove pine walls, a cast-iron wood stove, 2 deep-set windows that caught the morning light in a way that always made Carter feel like the world was being handed to him fresh. No one knew about it. That was the point. Not his co-workers at the Dixon warehouse where he managed receiving and shipping logistics. Not the women he'd briefly dated in the years since his divorce. Not even his mother, Brenda, who lived over in East Nashville and who he called every Sunday evening without fail. He'd told her once that he had a piece of land out west of the city, and she'd accepted that the way she accepted most of Carter's private arrangements, with a calm nod and the unspoken understanding that her son had always needed more room inside himself than most people required. The cabin was where he went when the noise of being a person in the world became too loud. Where he read whole novels in a weekend. Where he sat on the small porch at dusk and watched the tree line go dark while the first stars appeared, and felt, for the only time in his week, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He drove west on I-40 with the truck pushing 80, Nashville's skyline shrinking in the rear view, the Cumberland River dark below the bridge as he crossed it. The sky to the west was already wrong, a low orange smear above the tree line that had nothing to do with the hour. He smelled it before he saw it. That particular scent that is not like anything else in the world. Wood smoke mixed with something chemical and final, the odor of a structure giving itself back to the air. He turned off the highway onto Route 49, then onto the county road, then onto the gravel lane, and when he came around the last curve through the cedars and his headlights swept across the clearing, he stopped the truck and sat very still. The cabin was gone. Or rather, it was in the process of going. The walls had collapsed inward, and what remained was a low mound of orange embers and char, with one corner post still standing at an improbable angle, like a monument to itself. 2 Cheatham County fire trucks were parked at the edge of the clearing, and a pair of firefighters in turnout gear were directing water onto the remains, more to prevent spread than to save anything. There was nothing left to save. Carter got out of the truck. His legs felt strange, like the ground had changed consistency without warning. He walked toward the nearest firefighter, a broad man with a grey mustache who turned when he heard footsteps. "This your property?" the man asked. "Yeah." The firefighter's expression shifted into something professionally sympathetic, the face of a person who has delivered this kind of news many times and has not found a better way to do it. "I'm sorry, sir. We got the call around 3:45. Structure was already well involved when we arrived. We contained it to the footprint." "How'd it start?" A pause. "That's going to be a determination for the investigator. But I'll tell you, there's some things here that don't look accidental." Carter looked at the smouldering ruin of the only place that had been entirely his. He didn't cry. He wasn't built that way, or had unbuilt himself from it somewhere between the army and the divorce. What he felt instead was a slow, cold pressure behind his sternum, as though something were being compressed there that would need to be dealt with eventually, but could wait. "There are tire tracks," the firefighter said. "Multiple vehicles, and someone broke the door." Carter nodded. He stood there in the November dark, his breath visible in the cold air, watching the last of the cabin turn to ash. Deputy Hank Fowler arrived at 5:20, driving a Cheatham County cruiser with one headlight slightly misaligned, the beam drifting upward at the tree line in a way that gave it a vaguely hopeful quality. He was a tall man, early 40s, with the kind of face that had probably been open and trusting when he was younger, and had since acquired a professional wariness, not unkindness, just the careful reserve of someone who had learned not to assume. He shook Carter's hand and took down the basic information in a small notebook with a blue pen. Name, address, date of purchase. Last time Carter had been on the property, whether anyone else had keys or access. "No one," Carter said. "No one knew about the place. My mother knew I owned land out here. That's it." Fowler wrote something down. "How'd you keep it off the radar? Property tax records are public." "I just never told anyone, didn't post about it, didn't bring people out here." Carter paused. "I had one co-worker I mentioned it to once, about 8 months ago. Didn't give details, just said I had a cabin." Fowler noted that too. He walked the perimeter of the site with a flashlight, crouching twice to examine things Carter couldn't see from where he stood. When he came back, his expression had settled into something more deliberate. "3 sets of tire tracks in the mud at the lane entrance," he said. "Looks like 2 trucks and maybe a car. Somebody broke the door. Hasp is bent outward, not from heat damage. And we've got what looks like accelerant pore patterns near the east wall." He paused. "This wasn't an accident." "No," Carter agreed. "Do you have any enemies? Anyone with a grudge?" Carter thought about it honestly. He was a man who kept to himself, who managed a warehouse with quiet efficiency, who had ended his marriage 5 years ago with something approaching mutual exhaustion rather than hostility. He could not name a single person who actively wished him harm. "Not that I know of," he said, "but I don't know who knew about this property." That was the part that burrowed into him as the sun came up and Fowler drove away with a card and a promise to be in touch once the fire investigator filed his report. Someone had known or discovered, and they had come here, to his secret place, his 11 acres of quiet, and broken the door and poured something flammable and walked away while it burned. Carter stayed until the embers were cold. He walked the site in the grey morning light, salvaging what could be salvaged. A cast-iron skillet his uncle had given him, its handle warped but the cooking surface intact. A tin box of documents, deed, survey, insurance papers, that had been inside a small fireproof safe bolted to the floor, and which had survived, though the safe itself was fused shut and would need to be cut open. The wood stove, a massive black thing that had outlasted the walls around it, and now sat in the open air looking vaguely philosophical. He drove back to Nashville in a state that he could not have named precisely. Not grief exactly, because the cabin was a thing and things could be rebuilt. Not rage, because rage required a target and he didn't have one yet. Something more like a deep, patient wrongness, the sense that an injustice had been done to something that mattered and that it could not simply be absorbed and moved on from. At work, Monday morning, he told no one. He processed invoices and managed the receiving dock and ate his lunch at his desk and said nothing. Dale Mercer, who managed outbound shipping from the adjacent office and who had the interpersonal instincts of an eager golden retriever, stopped in the doorway around 2 in the afternoon. "You look rough, man. Everything okay?" "Fine," Carter said. "Didn't sleep great." Dale hovered for a moment in the way he always did, constitutionally incapable of letting a conversational opening pass without filling it. "Hey, whatever happened with that cabin you mentioned, out in Dixon County?" "Did you ever finish it?" Carter looked at him steadily. "Who'd you tell about that?" Dale's expression shifted through surprise into something uncomfortable. "What? Nobody. I mean—" He stopped. "I might have mentioned it at the Riverside thing back in the summer, the company cookout. Just in passing, I didn't give an address or anything." "Who was at that table when you mentioned it?" "I don't know. Troy and some of his people, I think. Carter, what's going on?" Carter wrote the name down on a notepad after Dale left. Troy. He didn't know anyone named Troy, but Fowler would. Deputy Fowler called on a Wednesday. The fire investigator's preliminary report confirmed accelerant use, specifically a petroleum distillate consistent with charcoal lighter fluid, and the tire track castings had produced partial impressions consistent with 2 full-size pickups and a sedan. There were no fingerprints. There were no witnesses. The gravel lane had yielded no useful shoe impressions. "We're looking at arson," Fowler said, "but looking at and charging are different things. Right now we have physical evidence of a crime and no direct link to a suspect." He paused. "You mentioned a name, Troy. I don't know his last name. A co-worker mentioned him. Someone who was at a company event where my cabin got mentioned. That's the only lead I have." Fowler made a sound of careful acknowledgement. "We'll look into it. These things take time, Mr. Aldridge. I want you to know we're taking it seriously." Carter thanked him and hung up and sat for a long time at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold. The insurance claim was another story entirely. He'd carried a standard rural property policy through an agent in Bellevue, and the adjuster, a brisk, efficiency-minded woman named Patrice, had informed him on the initial call that arson investigations triggered an automatic policy hold. The claim would be suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. This could take months. It could take longer. "We're not denying the claim," Patrice said, in the tone of someone who was effectively denying the claim. "We're just unable to process it until you know whether I burned it down myself," Carter said. A small pause. "Until the investigation is complete." He filed the claim paperwork anyway and added the folder to the growing stack on his kitchen table. The insurance documents, the fire investigator's report, Fowler's card, his own notes on the conversation with Dale. Evidence of a wound and no address to send the bill to. 3 weeks after the fire, he drove back out to the property on a Saturday. The ruins had settled further. The collapsed walls had compressed under their own weight, and the first frost had come through and left a skim of white on the char that made the whole site look like an ash-colored photograph of itself. Carter walked the perimeter again. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Confirmation that it had really happened, maybe. Or just the need to stand in the place where the thing had been and acknowledge it directly rather than from a distance. He was crouching near the east foundation wall, examining what he thought might be the outline of a boot print in the compacted earth along the base, when his phone rang. An unknown number, a 615 area code, Nashville, but no name attached. He almost didn't answer. He answered. "Is this Carter Aldridge?" A woman's voice, older, with the particular crispness of someone who had spent decades in institutional environments where clarity was expected. The Carter Aldridge who owns property at 2714 Chalk Ridge Road. Who is this? My name is Ruth Calloway. I'm retired now, but I worked in the Dickson County Property Records Office for 23 years. I saw the fire report in the county incident log. I still read it out of habit. A brief pause. I think I know something that might help you. Carter straightened slowly. The November sky hung flat and grey above the tree line. I'm listening. 3 months ago, early August, a young man came into the property records office and requested a printout of all parcels in this section of the county. He was looking for something specific. I don't usually remember walk-ins, but this one I remembered because he was asking about properties that had no active permits, no utility accounts, nothing that would indicate regular habitation. He was specifically interested in properties that seemed unused. What did he look like? Late 20s. Broad through the shoulders, ball cap green with some kind of logo. He paid cash for the printout, $3, gave his name as Troy Spicer. She let the name sit for a moment. I thought it was odd at the time. Not illegal, public records are public, but something about the specificity of what he was looking for. And then I saw the incident report for your property and I thought someone should know. Carter stood very still in the ruined clearing of his burned cabin. He felt the cold air on his face. He felt the specific quality of a thing that had been formless beginning to acquire shape. "Ruth," he said, "would you be willing to tell that to a sheriff's deputy?" "That's exactly why I called you, Mr. Aldridge." He sat down on the cold ground among the ashes of what he'd built and looked at the sky and breathed for a moment. The wind moved through the cedars at the edge of the clearing with a sound like patient, unhurried breathing. He'd been certain 3 weeks ago, standing at this same spot in the dark watching the fire trucks pack up, that he was alone in this. That the wrongness had been done to him and him alone, and that the world at large had not noticed and would not. He had been wrong. Deputy Fowler met Ruth Calloway at the Dickson County Sheriff's substation on a Tuesday morning, and Carter drove out for the meeting even though no one had asked him to. He sat in the parking lot in his truck for 20 minutes before deciding he was allowed to be there and going inside. Ruth was smaller than her voice had suggested. A compact woman in her early 60s with steel grey hair cut short, and the careful posture of someone who had spent decades behind a desk and had opinions about back support. She wore a blue cardigan and carried a large canvas tote bag from which she produced, with practiced efficiency, a personal copy of the records printout she'd made the day Troy Spicer had visited the office. "I kept a copy for my own files," she said to Fowler, placing the pages on the table between them, "which I acknowledge may be against the retention policy, but I was not going to leave the office that day without documentation of that transaction." Fowler studied the printout. Carter watched from across the table. The document was a list of 17 properties in the relevant section of Dickson County, parcels with no utility accounts, no active building permits, no evidence of regular habitation. Carter's property was third on the list, identified by its tax parcel number and legal description. His name appeared in the ownership column. "Troy Spicer," Fowler said. "We ran that name after Mr. Aldridge gave it to us. He's got a misdemeanor possession charge from 4 years ago and a dismissed disorderly conduct, no priors for property crime." He tapped the printout. "But this is different. This puts him at the county records office, asking specifically for the kind of property your cabin was, 3 months before the fire." "It's circumstantial," Carter said. "It's a thread," Fowler agreed, "but it's a thread I can pull." He looked at Ruth. "Were there security cameras in the records office?" "There were. And before you ask, yes, I already spoke to the county IT director. They retain 90 days of footage. August 8th is right at the edge of that window." She reached into the canvas bag again and produced a thumb drive. "He was kind enough to pull it for me when I explained the situation." Fowler took the thumb drive with an expression that suggested he had not encountered this level of preparation from a civilian witness in some time. "Ms. Calloway," he said, "you understand that what you've done here is genuinely helpful." "I worked in county government for 23 years, Ruth said. "I know what documentation looks like, and I know what it takes. Nobody was going to connect these dots for this man unless someone did the work." She glanced at Carter. "I also have a son about your age, Mr. Aldridge. He built a workshop in our backyard that took him 3 years. I understand what it means when someone destroys something you built yourself." Carter looked at the table. He did not trust himself to speak for a moment. The footage was reviewed that afternoon. Troy Spicer was clearly identifiable, a broad-shouldered young man in a green cap with a Vanderbilt Commodores logo, paying cash at the counter, accepting the printout with barely a second glance at the clerk processing his request. Fowler obtained a warrant that Thursday. The investigation that followed took 6 weeks, and Carter was not privy to most of it. He received updates from Fowler in sparse, careful language. A search of Spicer's property had yielded receipts for lighter fluid and a tire track comparison that was described as highly consistent. 2 of Spicer's associates, when interviewed separately, gave statements that did not align with each other and produced enough inconsistency that both eventually provided fuller accounts. Carter learned the motive late in the process, in a phone call from Fowler that he took standing in the parking lot of his apartment complex in the grey December cold. Spicer and his group had, apparently, been using remote or unoccupied properties in the area for parties, camping without permission, using fire rings, occasionally taking what wasn't theirs. They'd visited Carter's property in late October, found the cabin locked, broken in, and used it for a weekend. When they returned a month later and found that someone had been there since, Carter had visited in mid-November and replaced the hasp they'd damaged, they'd apparently decided that eliminating the cabin was preferable to risking someone calling the authorities about them. "They burned it down," Carter said, "because they got caught breaking in, and their solution was to destroy the evidence." "That's what the statements suggest," Fowler said. Carter stood in the parking lot in the cold and turned this information over in his mind. He had expected, when the truth finally came, to feel something volcanic, a satisfying eruption of justified anger. What he felt instead was smaller and sadder. These were not people who had set out to destroy something meaningful. They had just been careless and cowardly, and something irreplaceable had burned because of it. Troy Spicer and 2 associates were charged with arson in the 2nd degree and breaking and entering. The charges were filed just before Christmas. That same week, the insurance company lifted the hold on Carter's claim. January came to Middle Tennessee with a particular grimness. Low clouds and frozen mud, and the kind of cold that had no drama to it, just an insistent, patient discomfort. Carter drove out to the property on the 2nd Saturday of the new year with a thermos of coffee and a yellow legal pad, intending to do nothing more than sit in his truck at the edge of the clearing and think. He had the insurance settlement in his account. Not a fortune. The cabin had been built on sweat equity more than materials cost, and the policy had been a modest one. But enough to rebuild the structure if he was careful and did most of the work himself again. He had plans, roughly sketched, that were better than the first iteration. A covered porch facing east, a proper foundation rather than the pier blocks he'd used originally, a second window in the north wall to let in the winter light. He had not yet decided whether to begin. That was the thing he'd been turning over for the past several weeks, in the quiet spaces of his apartment, in the idle moments at work. The cabin had been a private thing, a refuge from the world precisely because the world didn't know about it. Its secrecy had been part of its value. Now the secrecy was gone. It appeared in a fire report, in a sheriff's case file, in court documents. People knew it would never again be the thing it had been. He was sitting with this thought, his coffee going cold in his lap, when a white Honda Civic turned off the county road and came down the gravel lane. He recognized it, Ruth Calloway's car, the same one he'd seen in the parking lot of the substation 2 months ago. She parked beside his truck and got out carrying a thermos of her own and a small paper bag from a bakery in Dixon that Carter had driven past 100 times without stopping. She walked to the edge of the clearing, looked at the ruins for a long moment and then turned to Carter. "I hope it's all right that I came," she said. "I drove by this road last week. I wasn't sure if you'd be here." "It's all right," he said. She opened the paper bag and offered it. Inside were 2 slices of apple cake wrapped in parchment. Carter accepted one. They stood at the edge of the burned clearing in the January cold, eating apple cake and looking at the ruins, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was comfortable in a way that Carter found surprising. "Are you going to rebuild?" Ruth asked eventually. "I'm trying to decide." "What's the question?" He thought about how to put it. The thing about this place was that nobody knew it existed. That was the whole point. And now it's in police reports and court filings, and you know about it, and Deputy Fowler knows about it. He paused. It can't be what it was. Ruth considered this seriously, the way she seemed to consider most things. "No," she agreed, "it can't be what it was." She looked at the standing corner post that had survived both the fire and the weather and was beginning to list slightly to the north. "But I'm not sure that means it can't be something." "Something," Carter repeated. "My husband used to say there are 2 kinds of private. The first kind is just secrecy. You protect it by making sure nobody knows. The second kind is deeper than that. It's private because of what it means to you, and that doesn't go away because other people learn it exists." She turned to look at him directly. "Your cabin was private for the right reasons, Mr. Aldridge, not because you were hiding something wrong, because you needed a place that was yours. That reason is still there." Carter looked at the ruins. He thought about the mornings he'd sat on the porch he would build better this time, watching the tree line come into focus in the early light. He thought about his Uncle Roy, whose knees were too bad now to drive, but who had called him when he heard about the fire and talked for 40 minutes about wood grades and foundation options, and which concrete block suppliers in Cheatham County were worth using. He thought about his mother, who had said only, "You'll build it again, and it'll be better," in a tone that conveyed not optimism, but simple certainty. "I have a question," he said to Ruth. "Why did you call me?" "You could have just called the sheriff's office directly." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I thought about that. I decided that you deserved to know first, before any institutional process got hold of it and turned it into paperwork." She looked at the ruins again. "Something that mattered to you was destroyed, that seemed like something that deserved a human voice, not a form." Carter nodded slowly. He would think about that for a long time afterward. The simple decision a woman he'd never met had made to pick up the phone and speak to him as a person rather than pass information through channels. It had not recovered the cabin. It had not undone the loss. But it had altered something about the experience of the loss, had made it something that happened to a person who was known, rather than a fact recorded in a county incident log. "I'm going to rebuild," he said. It came out with a conviction he hadn't entirely expected. "The porch faces east. I'm putting in a proper foundation this time." Ruth smiled, a small, genuine thing. "Good. Make the windows bigger. The light out here in the morning is worth seeing properly." He drove back to Nashville that afternoon, with the legal pad open on the passenger seat, covered in notes, foundation specs, lumber grades, a list of calls to make. He stopped at his mother's house in East Nashville unannounced, something he hadn't done in years, and sat in her kitchen for 2 hours while she made him dinner, and he told her, really told her, about the cabin, what it had looked like, what it had meant, what he was going to build in its place. Brenda Aldridge listened without interruption, the way she always had. And when he was done, she refilled his coffee and said, "That woman who called you, Ruth, that was a kind thing." "It was," Carter said. "You should write her a letter, not a text, a real letter." He wrote it that night. 4 paragraphs on paper torn from the legal pad, the handwriting not as clean as he'd have liked, but honest, which seemed more important. He thanked her not just for the information, but for the choice she'd made about how to deliver it, for deciding that the human thing was worth the extra step. He sealed it and addressed it to Ruth Calloway, 14 Sycamore Bend, Dixon, Tennessee, which he'd learned from the county records the same way she'd once learned his address, and he put it in the mailbox before he could reconsider. Ground broke on the new cabin in early March, on a Saturday when the redbuds were just starting along the creek and the mud had dried enough to work. Carter's Uncle Roy drove out from Clarksville, knees and all, and stood at the edge of the clearing with a cup of coffee and told him everything he was doing wrong in a tone of such fond exasperation that Carter laughed for the first time in months. The corner post from the original cabin, the one that had stood through the fire and the winter and the ice and the slow lean of time, Carter had his uncle help him set it aside rather than haul it to the debris pile. He didn't know yet exactly what he would do with it, but it had survived something, and that seemed worth acknowledging, worth keeping somewhere visible in whatever came next. He never heard from Troy Spicer or his associates after the plea agreement was reached in February. 2 years probation and restitution payments that Carter suspected would never arrive in full. He found that he did not need to hear from them. The case had run its course and produced its outcome, and Carter had learned slowly that what he required from justice was not satisfaction, but simply an accurate accounting, that the thing had been done, that it was wrong, that it was named. Ruth Calloway drove out once during the construction in April, when the walls were framed and the roof was sheeted but the windows hadn't gone in yet. She stood in the open frame of the east-facing doorway and looked out at the clearing and said it was going to be fine. Carter believed her. He moved a folding chair and a cooler out to the site and started spending Saturday mornings there again before the cabin was finished, sitting in the open framing with his coffee, watching the light come through the cedars, relearning the particular quality of this piece of ground. It was different now. Known by more people, present in more records. A place with a history that included its own destruction, but the creek still ran at the bottom of the hollow, cold and particular in its sound. The red buds still came in March. The early light still moved across the clearing in a way that made the world seem briefly, quietly extraordinary. Carter Aldridge sat in a folding chair in the frame of a half-built cabin and drank his coffee and watched the light, and felt, not happy exactly, which seemed too simple, but something more durable than that. The sense that something had been broken and was being made again, and that the people who had helped him were out there in the world somewhere, going about their lives, carrying a piece of what had happened here without knowing how large that piece was. He would finish the porch by May. The windows, he had decided, would be bigger.